The midday sun blazed high in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the quiet, suburban streets just outside Washington, D.C. The air buzzed with the distant hum of lawnmowers and the occasional bark of a neighborhood dog. General Jonathan Jack Carter, a towering figure of discipline and strength, maneuvered his black Cadillac Escalade down the pristine roads, heading home from an early strategic briefing at the Pentagon. His crisp Army service uniform was impeccable, the shimmering four-star insignia on his shoulders commanding immediate respect. As he slowed down near a local bakery, considering stopping for a fresh coffee, the tranquility of the moment was shattered. The shriek of police sirens cut through the peaceful afternoon like a blade. Jack barely had time to glance at his rearview mirror before red and blue lights flooded the interior of his vehicle. He frowned but calmly guided the Escalade to the side of the road, his years of military discipline kicking in. The sudden stop caused a few loose documents on the passenger seat to slide forward, but he ignored them, instead shifting his focus to the situation unfolding behind him. Through his side mirror, he saw them, two uniformed police officers approaching rapidly. Their movements were stiff, their hands hovering far too eagerly over their holsters. Something about their body language was off. This wasn't a routine stop. Jack kept both hands firmly on the wheel, his posture relaxed but alert. He had been in life-threatening situations before: war zones, hostile negotiations, classified operations. But this was different. This was home. This was supposed to be safe. The first officer, a burly man with a shaved head and mirrored sunglasses, reached the driver's side window and rapped on the glass hard. It wasn't the polite tap of a routine traffic stop, but an aggressive, almost confrontational knock. Jack rolled down the window slowly, keeping his expression neutral. "Step out of the vehicle now," the officer barked. No explanation, no standard greeting, no request for ID or registration, just immediate, unwarranted escalation. Jack didn't move right away. His mind worked fast, analyzing. No probable cause had been stated, no reason given, and they hadn't even asked for his license. That wasn't protocol. "Is there a reason for this, officer?" Jack's voice was calm, measured, the same tone he used in high-stakes military briefings. The second officer, a wiry man with nervous energy, stepped forward, one hand hovering over his holster. "Did I stutter?" I said, "Step out of the car." Jack exhaled slowly. He knew exactly what was happening. He had seen it before. Different battlefield, same war. But these officers had no idea who they had just pulled over, and they were about to find out. Jack could feel the tension thickening in the air, pressing against his skin like the sweltering heat of the midday sun. He had spent decades navigating some of the world's most dangerous territories, from the deserts of the Middle East to the war-torn jungles of South America. Yet standing on American soil, in the very country he had sworn to defend, he was being treated like a criminal. His grip on the steering wheel remained firm, his eyes locked onto the mirrored sunglasses of the officer looming over him. The silence stretched between them like a tripwire. "I'll ask again," the first officer snapped, his hand now openly resting on his holstered weapon. "Step out of the car." Jack's military instincts kicked in. Observe, assess, control. These men were looking for submission, for compliance through fear. But fear was a foreign concept to a man who had commanded battalions in combat, who had led soldiers through gunfire and chaos. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the door handle and pushed it open, stepping out with an effortless authority that seemed to shift the very atmosphere around them. He wasn't just tall, he carried himself with the kind of presence that made people stop and reconsider their next move. The officers tensed. They had expected something different: panic, excuses, maybe even defiance. But not this. Jack adjusted his uniform, his ribbons and medals catching the sunlight in a dazzling display of honor and achievement. He clasped his hands behind his back, a stance of unwavering confidence. "Now," he said, his voice controlled with a touch of steel beneath the surface, "would you care to explain why I'm being stopped?" The second officer swallowed, glancing at his partner. Jack caught it immediately. That flicker of doubt, that brief moment where they realized something was off. The first officer, still trying to maintain control, cleared his throat. "We got a call about a suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood." Jack arched an eyebrow. A suspicious vehicle? He glanced at his Escalade, pristine and unremarkable, except for the military parking permit in the windshield. In broad daylight, a black man driving through a nice neighborhood? Was that the suspicion? The second officer shifted uncomfortably, but the first one doubled down, ignoring the question. We're just doing our job. Jack tilted his head slightly. And part of your job is stopping someone without probable cause, not asking for ID, registration, or even explaining the reason for the stop before demanding they step out of the car? A long, heavy pause followed. The two officers weren't used to being questioned, at least not like this. They were used to fear, compliance, people stumbling over themselves to obey. But Jack Carter was a different breed. Then, without warning, the first officer made his mistake. He reached for his gun, not drawing it, but his fingers wrapped around the handle, a silent threat hanging in the air, like a blade about to drop. Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, and what he said next made the officer's blood run cold. Jack's smile was subtle, but it carried the weight of 1,000 battles won, not through brute force, but through strategy, through control, through an unshakable presence. He took a slow step forward, not enough to be aggressive, but just enough to make the officers feel the shift in power. The first officer's grip tightened on his holster, his confidence wavered just for a moment. You ever been in a combat zone, officer? Jack's voice cut through the thick tension like a blade, smooth and sharp. The officer blinked. That was not the response he was expecting. Jack didn't wait for an answer. He continued, his tone as steady as the men he had led through fire and death. Ever had to make a life or death decision where hesitation meant losing a man? Maybe your whole unit? The second officer hesitated, shifting on his feet. The first one opened his mouth, then closed it. Jack took another slow step forward. Because I have. I've been in situations where every breath you take might be your last, where the difference between walking away and dying on foreign soil comes down to discipline, judgment, and knowing exactly who you're dealing with. The first officer scoffed, trying to reclaim control. Yeah, and what does that have to do with this stop? Jack's eyes locked onto him, unwavering. Because right now, you're making decisions like a rookie with no training. You've already broken standard procedure, failed to ask for identification, failed to state your reason for stopping me, and now you're letting your hand rest on your weapon when there is zero threat. That tells me one thing. You don't know what you're doing. The first officer's face flushed red. I don't have to. Jack cut him off. Oh, but you do. And let me tell you why. He reached slowly, very slowly, into his breast pocket, pulling out a neatly folded piece of paper. The second officer stiffened, his hand twitching toward his holster. Jack shook his head. Relax, it's not what you think. He unfolded the paper with practiced precision and turned it so the officers could see. It was an official letter from the White House, signed by the President of the United States. Jack waited a beat, then continued. You see, I just left a classified briefing at the Pentagon, a meeting that involved national security measures that you wouldn't begin to understand. And right now, you've stopped the wrong man, at the wrong time, in the wrong way. The first officer's face twisted, but now there was something else in his expression. Doubt. Jack stepped even closer, lowering his voice just enough to make them lean in. Here's what's going to happen next. You're going to take your hand off that holster, you're going to step back, and then you're going to think long and hard about why you thought stopping a man in full military uniform without probable cause was a good idea. The first officer's jaw clenched. He was still trying to hold on to his authority, but it was slipping fast. Jack didn't blink. Because if you don't, gentlemen, your next conversation will be with the Secretary of Defense. The second officer inhaled sharply, his eyes flickering to his partner, silently urging him to back down. The first officer's hand finally, reluctantly, lifted off his gun. Jack tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't done yet. The first officer took half a step back, but his pride wouldn't let him fully concede. His nostrils flared, and his jaw worked as if chewing over his next words. The second officer, now visibly uneasy, shifted his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting between Jack and his partner. Jack remained utterly still, his military training making him an immovable force. His deep, calculating gaze locked on the first officer, dissecting him, stripping him down to the core. Jack had seen men like him before, young, reckless, and too arrogant to realize they were standing on the edge of their own undoing. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Then Jack spoke again, his voice calm but edged with an authority that made the very air seem heavier. "Tell me something, officer," he said, his words deliberate. "What was your plan here?" The first officer's lips parted, but no words came out. Jack tilted his head slightly. "No, really, I'd like to know. You see a man driving through a neighborhood in broad daylight, in a legally registered vehicle with no violations. You don't ask for ID. You don't state a reason for stopping him. Instead, you go straight to demanding he step out. That tells me you were never interested in a traffic stop. So what was your plan?" The officer's face darkened, his fingers twitching at his sides. "We got a call." "A call about what?" Jack pressed. "A suspicious vehicle? Or a suspicious driver?" The second officer inhaled sharply, knowing exactly what Jack was implying. Jack took a step forward, his towering frame making the first officer instinctively lean back. "Let me tell you what I think," Jack continued, his voice dropping lower, more intense. "I think you were looking for someone to intimidate, someone to throw your weight around with. Maybe you thought I'd stammer, fumble for excuses, apologize for simply existing where you didn't think I belonged. But I've spent my life walking into war zones where people had real power, real weapons, real reasons to pull the trigger." His gaze sharpened. "And you? You're just a man in a uniform holding a gun you clearly don't even trust yourself with." The first officer's face was now bright red, his breath coming in short, frustrated puffs. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. Jack straightened his shoulders, the ribbons and badges on his chest catching the sunlight again. "You think your badge gives you power? It doesn't. It gives you responsibility. And from what I've seen today, you are failing at that responsibility." The second officer took another step back, as if trying to distance himself from what was unfolding. Jack wasn't done. He let the silence sit, let the weight of his words sink in. Then with a cold, unshakable finality, he said, "And if you were smart, officer, you'd be a lot more careful about who you try to intimidate." The first officer opened his mouth, ready to fire back with something, anything, to regain control of the situation. But before he could, Jack did something that made both officers freeze where they stood. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out something small, something unassuming, a business card. And as he held it up for them to see, their faces went pale. The business card was simple, crisp, and professional. But it wasn't the card itself that made both officers' faces drain of color. It was the name embossed in bold, unmistakable lettering. General Jonathan Carter, United States Army, Joint Chiefs of Staff. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of a lawnmower down the street and the occasional chirping of birds. The first officer stared at the card, his lips slightly parted as if trying to form a response but failing. The second officer, his nervous energy now bordering on panic, swallowed hard. Jack didn't move. He let them absorb the gravity of the situation. "You're looking at a man who advises the president on matters of national security," Jack said, his voice calm but edged with quiet steel. "A man who has commanded thousands of troops, strategized against foreign threats, and personally written policy that dictates the operations of the United States military." He took a step closer, his towering presence forcing both officers to instinctively lean back. "And today," Jack continued, his gaze drilling into them, "you thought it was a good idea to stop that man on the side of the road, to treat him like a criminal, to put your hand on your weapon without reason, all because you saw my skin before you saw my uniform." The second officer opened his mouth, perhaps to deny it, to offer some pathetic excuse, but Jack held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. "Don't," Jack warned, "because there is no justification that won't sound ridiculous right now." The first officer shifted his stance, looking anywhere but at Jack, his hands clenched at his sides as his mind raced for an escape from the mess he had just created. Jack let out a slow exhale, his patience thinning. Do you have any idea how bad this could get for you? He tapped the business card against the officer's chest. The sound was small but carried the weight of an anvil. I make one phone call, Jack said, his voice a low rumble, and your names will be on the desk of the Attorney General by the end of the day. You'll be lucky if you're reassigned to park enforcement in the middle of nowhere by next week. The first, the first officer's jaw was clenched so tight that a vein throbbed along his temple. The second officer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else but here. Jack watched them for a moment longer, then finally stepped back, sliding the business card back into his pocket. You need to think long and hard about the choices you made today, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a commander addressing his subordinates. Because today you got lucky. You stopped the wrong man, but the right man handled it. If I had been someone else, someone without the ability to expose you for what you are, how do you think this would have ended? Silence followed. Jack nodded slightly. Exactly. He turned, taking his time as he walked back to his Escalade. But before he got in, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Now, let's see if you've learned anything. His voice was measured, but there was an unmistakable challenge in his tone. Am I free to go, officers? The two men stiffened. The second officer gave a shaky nod. The first officer hesitated, his pride still warring with the reality of the situation. But in the end, there was only one answer. Yes, he finally muttered. Jack smirked. Good choice. And with that, he got into his car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the officers standing there staring after him, their careers hanging by a thread. But Jack wasn't done teaching them a lesson. No, not yet. As he drove away, he kept his hands steady on the wheel, his expression unreadable. The tension in his muscles remained, but his mind was already working ahead. He had faced worse threats in his lifetime. Enemy combatants, insurgent leaders, and high-ranking officials who wielded power like a weapon. And yet, here he was, dealing with something just as insidious, something just as dangerous in its own way. This wasn't about him. This was about the countless men and women who weren't high-ranking generals, who didn't have direct access to the president or the Secretary of Defense, who wouldn't have a business card that could stop an officer in his tracks. Jack knew this couldn't just end here. He pulled into a nearby gas station, parking his Escalade in the farthest corner of the lot. Reaching into his glove compartment, he retrieved a secured, government-issued tablet. Entering his credentials with swift precision, he was connected within seconds to a classified communications channel reserved for top military personnel. He tapped on a contact. Secretary of Defense William Hargrove. The call was answered almost immediately. General Carter, came a deep, authoritative voice. Didn't expect to hear from you again so soon. What's the situation? Jack exhaled, leaning back in his seat. We have a problem. Hargrove didn't need more context. He knew Jack well enough to understand that if he was making this call, it wasn't about something minor. Go on, the secretary prompted. Jack didn't waste time. He recounted the stop, every detail, every misstep those officers had made, the reckless way they escalated a situation that had no cause. His voice was steady, but the weight of his words was unmistakable. When he finished, there was silence on the other end. Then Hargrove let out a slow breath. You want me to handle this? He stated rather than asked. I want this addressed at the highest level, Jack confirmed, because today I walked away from that stop. But there are men and women who don't, and I don't intend to let that stand. Hargrove was quiet for a moment before responding. Consider it done. Jack nodded once, ending the call. It was only then that he allowed himself to sit back fully, his fingers tapping idly against the leather of the steering wheel. There would be repercussions for those officers, not just for their actions today, but for the larger system they represented. Jack wasn't just interested in punishing two men, he was interested in making sure this didn't happen again. And by the time the sun set, those officers would have no idea what was coming. The next morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, two officers sat uncomfortably in a small, dimly lit office inside the local precinct. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every second feel like an hour. The first officer, the one who had nearly drawn his weapon on General Carter, shifted in his chair, his jaw clenched, his fingers drumming anxiously against his knee. The second officer sat stiffly beside him, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds, as if expecting an executioner to walk in at any moment. Then the door opened. The station's chief of police entered first, his face unreadable, but the rigid set of his shoulders betrayed the weight of the situation. And behind him, wearing the same crisp uniform that had sent chills down their spines just the day before, was General Jonathan Carter. The officers' throats went dry. Jack took his time stepping into the room, his mere presence sucking the air out of it. He didn't speak right away, and that made it even worse. His eyes moved slowly over the two officers, analyzing them, watching them squirm. Then in a voice that was both calm and commanding, he spoke. "You should consider yourselves lucky." The words sent a shudder through both men. The chief cleared his throat. "General Carter was kind enough to bring this to my attention personally," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "And after a conversation with the Secretary of Defense, as well as certain people in Washington, it was decided that the appropriate course of action needed to be swift and severe." The second officer swallowed hard. He already knew what was coming. The chief's gaze turned icy. "You're both suspended indefinitely, effective immediately." The room went dead silent. The first officer's jaw clenched. "Chief, we were—" "Don't," Jack said simply, cutting him off. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried more weight than a gun ever could. "Because there is nothing you can say that will justify what happened yesterday." The first officer shut his mouth, his entire body tensing with barely restrained frustration. But what could he say? He knew deep down that this wasn't just about yesterday. It was about every unchecked moment before that, every traffic stop where they had let their biases control their actions, every person they had intimidated, humiliated, or endangered without cause. Jack took a slow step forward. "What you did wasn't just reckless," he said. "It wasn't just unprofessional. It was dangerous. You let your assumptions dictate your actions, and those actions nearly led to a situation you wouldn't have been able to walk away from." The second officer finally found his voice. It was small, barely above a whisper. "We didn't know who you were." Jack's eyes sharpened. He took another step closer. "And that's the problem," he said. "Because if I had been anyone else, anyone without the rank, without the power, without the ability to fight back, what would have happened then?" Neither officer answered. They couldn't. Jack let the silence sit, pressing into them like an unrelenting force. Then he finally exhaled and turned to the chief. "They're done," he said, not as a question but as a statement. The chief nodded stiffly. "Effective immediately," he confirmed, "and a full investigation into previous stops is already underway." Jack studied the two officers for a moment. Then, just as calmly as he had walked in, he turned and headed for the door. But before stepping out, he paused, glancing back one last time. "You were given power," he said, "and you abused it. Now you're going to learn what it's like to have none." With that, he walked away, leaving the two officers sitting in the suffocating silence of their own downfall. Jack stepped outside the precinct, the morning air crisp against his skin, as he took a slow breath. The sun had fully risen now, casting golden light over the city. A new day, a different kind of battle. But he knew this wasn't just about those two officers. This was about something bigger, about the countless others who had found themselves in a situation like his, but without the power to push back, without the rank, without the influence. And that was something Jack Carter could not and would not ignore. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from Secretary Hargrove. "Handled. Full review of department underway. Change is coming. We'll make sure of it." Jack exhaled, a small nod of satisfaction barely visible. It wasn't everything. It wasn't justice for everyone. But it was a start. He climbed into his Escalade, adjusting the cuffs of his uniform before placing both hands on the wheel. His reflection stared back at him in the rearview mirror. A soldier, a leader, a man who had faced enemies on foreign battlefields and now an entirely different kind of enemy right at home. But one thing Jack Carter had learned in all his years of service: power isn't in the badge, the gun, or the title. It's in the choices you make. Today, two men who once thought themselves untouchable had learned exactly what happens when you misuse that power. Jack started the engine, the low hum filling the quiet morning air, then drove forward, toward his next mission, another day, the fight that never really ended. Because battles weren't always fought on foreign soil. Sometimes the war was right here at home.